o'clock Eastern is not a decent time for a Californian. That's a horrible time. Again, everybody, great to see all of you, and thanks for sticking with us to the end of the second day. I'm actually really excited about this presentation, probably more than the one yesterday, because the two guys that we've brought up here are really important people for me personally. So Carl Howe hired me and was my boss about 15 years ago. I actually prepared remarks like this was a wedding or something, so I'm going to read to you. And I don't mean to embarrass them both. But I learned more from Carl in a shorter amount of time than probably I have from anybody else in my life, and I'm not exaggerating. Even then, he probably still thought I was a slow learner. But one of the things that stuck with me then and inspired me to think about technology the way I do is that he saw what he's about to present a little bit to us now, what we call the extended internet and the executable internet, what we now call apps in the IoT, in 2001. He wrote a forecast about that in 2001. So back when we were still trying to get our heads around the web, he saw that and could even explain it. Paul Sonderegger and I were peers about the same time. So we had same job, different groups. But he was and remains one of the funniest and most insightful people that I've ever worked with. And he's extremely good at communicating. So now I've built these guys up so high, right? But he could always say more in like 3 words than I could write in pages. So he's also really good at seeing technology and where that is going to go. So where they are now is at Teradata. So Carl's at Teradata, which is a big data and analytics firm, one of the best, if not the very best in the world. So he gets a really broad perspective on what's going on, not just across industries, but across countries, as we were talking about earlier. And Paul went to a company called Endeca that Oracle bought for $1 billion-ish. Yeah. So Paul knows a little bit about data too, and he's now the big data strategist for Oracle. So we're going to have a conversation, but before we do that, I want to introduce you to them. So Carl, Paul, this is Lux, colleagues and clients and friends. They're very nice people, and I hope that you will come up with some good questions based on the things that you've seen and heard here today and the little intro we're going to get from Carl right now. So Carl, please.
Thank you, Mark. Well, it's just such a pleasure to be here. And I was particularly struck by Doug's introduction. What is past is prologue. And there's no better introduction than this exact talk, because this location, the Westin Hotel, is where I was standing literally 15 years ago. And I'm going to tell you about the X-Internet, which is what we called it then, big data and the Internet of Things, but past, present, and future. So as Mark alluded to, I was here talking about the X-Internet. I was the keynote speaker for Forrester Forum, and the lead sentence pretty much said it all at that point: the web's days are numbered. It's a pretty audacious thing to say in 2001. Some of the people who are kind of leading the industry are folks like Netscape, and who just had a huge IPO. And Google, they're new guys, but they sound kind of interesting. Needless to say, we got roasted pretty badly by the press. They said things like, "Oh, the death of the web? Really? Are you serious?" This was really pretty controversial. Now, one of the ways I like to think about this, though, is our argument was that the web was not serving its audience well. It was not bad for addressing the 400 million or so internet users at the time. Isn't that number quaint now? 400 million internet users, not very many. And our argument was pretty simple. We're going to need software to make those users happy. That's called the executable internet. But my argument, that was George Colony, who was my boss, also the CEO of Forrester Research. He sort of said, that's what we really need. And I sort of said, yeah, but if we're really going to serve the needs of the business looking forward, we're going to need to serve the rest of it. And that's what I called the extended internet. Automobiles, telephones, electronic chips, all these things that we now call the Internet of Things. Well, being a good analyst, of course, I can't just make the assertion. I actually have to forecast something. So I created a forecast. This is literally the 2001 forecast for the Internet of Things. The main thing you want to keep track of is this number, which is the Internet devices. Notice it's pretty small back in 2001. And I made the assertion it's going to be about 14 billion by 2010. Well, we now have some data on this, and I didn't take into account the 2008-2009 recession, but this is a chart. It's actually, I think, a Cisco chart, but this one actually comes from an Indian organization. But it basically says we passed about 14 billion just about 2014. Prediction is about 50 billion in 2020. So pretty cool. Got a forecast right, big deal. But I did actually write some words in here too. And what I like is particularly the last bullet, because this kind of guided my future. The last bullet, I'm just going to focus on the very last sentence. All analytical companies will thrive by preventing companies from drowning in the data that the X-Internet provides and help them understand what it means. It's pretty profound in 2001. I didn't realize I was going to leave Forrester, do my own startup, and then move on to think about quantitative data in a more serious way. In particular, I wanted to look at big data. So that's what I do now. I'm actually part of Think Big. We're a services firm, part of Teradata, but we're vendor neutral. And we do entirely open source work. That was another report I wrote, which was the impact of open source on business. And what we do is we help companies profit from big data. So I'm just going to give a couple of use cases. This is one of a disk drive maker. This is happens to be HGST's 10 terabyte drive. Fun thing about disk drives, one of the most high technology mechanical devices sold to consumers today. It is just amazing how much technology goes into what the guys in the disk drive business like to call rust on stainless steel. But it's actually, these were about 600 million devices shipped in 2015. And you know what they sold for? They sold for $62 on average. The most high technology mechanical device sold to consumers. And they sell for $62. Do you think this industry might have an issue with margins? Yeah. The factories are literally 2/3 test equipment. 1/3 makes the devices, 2/3 test equipment. And we visited with a disk drive maker, and their CEO said, you know, if you can reduce return rates by 2%, just 2%, that's worth about $10 million annually to us. Could you do that? And we said, yeah. And this is actually a pattern that we see in big data all the time nowadays. We can use a big Hadoop cluster. And what we can do is we can buffer and collect all the data into one cloud location. We can then visualize the platters themselves. By the way, they could do that, but they could only do it for a sample. We visualize every single one of them. And then we're going to use machine learning to discover failures. This is a pattern we see over and over again, this 3-step process. Bring the data together, do something with it, visualize it, extract data, and then use machine learning on it. So the results are pretty good. Actual results weren't 10 million, though. They were actually about 50 million, and that's a direct quote from the CEO. He said, you guys are really pikers. This saves us about $50 million a year, and it's going up as we move forward. So I said, this is a pattern that comes across in big data. It's an example of the Internet of Things. But one of the most interesting things about disk drives, by the way, each disk drive has about as much data about the disk drive as the disk drive contains. So that 10 terabyte drive that actually sells for a few $100s has 10 terabytes of metadata associated with it. This idea that we're going to have large amounts of data, those drives themselves continue to gather data. They work on imperfect things, literally rust on steel, and they make them into things that look pretty perfect. So they're always sending back a lot of data. They're part of the Internet of Things. Another example, big disk drive company. This is one that makes storage boxes. They had a similar problem. They have thousands of devices, multiple generations. They're phoning home every night with gigabytes of data, and they need failure predictions too. They have exactly the same problems. If you're selling a $1 million device, you're just as worried about returns as you are if you're selling a disk drive. So rinse and repeat. We do the same thing again. We collected all the data into one big massive cluster. We build out tools to extract common features for each platform, and then we apply machine learning to it again. Same results, similar savings. One final example in use cases. Again, big data in the Internet of Things. How many of you flew here? Everybody, or a lot of people. Well, did you know that one jet engine collects about 20 terabytes per hour? That's a quote from our CTO, and it sounds about right. It's a pretty big number. Can you analyze 20 terabytes of data per hour across 50,000 flights a day? Boy, that's going to be really tough. Yet, if you're making jet engines, that's really important because those jet engines are really expensive devices. So what do? They actually do something really pretty interesting, which is so long as everything's going fine, they collect the data about once a second. So we sample once a second during normal operations. But if a red flag goes up, all of a sudden it shifts into high gear. So they start increasing the rate of sampling to about 60 samples per second. It's a way to avoid a problem that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. But this is a key idea. We can change how often we gather data, depending upon what it means. All right, so basically the neat thing here is they reduce the amount of data they might have collected, because they can clearly sample at 60 cycles per second. They collected about 60 times less data from most normal operations. Pretty cool. All right, so that's today. What about the future? So I figured since I was standing here 15 years ago today, I should actually say, okay, what's the future look like in 15 years? Well, I've got some easy ones for you. This one's not going to be heavy lifting. The first one is, everything we think about this internet gap that we had before, we're going to close it. The people that are involved in the internet today are basically going to be a small part of the total traffic. This stuff we do with web browsers and the like is very nice, but the total traffic is actually going to be much larger, and most of it's going to be machine generated. The place I'm going to start is really something pretty simple. We're not just going to call it the X internet or the Y internet or the 2031 internet. We're just going to call it the internet because that's what it is. And by the way, this same applies to big data. This is a marketing term. It was used to sell the idea to people. It's just data. Let's call it data from now on, because the real secret of big data is taking it and turning it to small data, namely decisions. So I know no CEOs who want to look at a petabyte. They don't have time, they're not interested, it's boring. So we're really just going to work with data. So I'm going to give you 4 predictions about what the internet of 2031 looks like. And just like that first presentation I gave, they're going to be a little on the negative side. There are things we're going to have to watch out for. And my first is this. This is e-waste. I think I'm going to coin a new term here. It's called de-waste. Data pollution is going to get to be a significant problem. That jet engine, today there's a lot of IoT that just says, hey, you get some data, throw it into the cloud. We need that. Got more data? Send it again. Did it change? Nope. It's still the same data, but we're going to put it in the cloud anyway. That's data pollution. You don't want to send data that doesn't mean anything. And this is a real problem. This is why we have Hadoop clusters today. Because enterprises didn't know what data they really needed, so they just are collecting all of it and analyzing it. Tommy terabyte today, that's a term coined by EMC about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is going to turn into Peter petabyte tomorrow. And we're going to need even bigger clusters to make sense of it. We're going to have to find the gold in the e-waste. And that's just going to get harder and harder and harder. So when you think about big data strategies, this is one: avoid data pollution. Number 2 is this one. This is actually a graph from Nanex. They analyze financial markets. They actually are a big data company. They collect all the data from the financial markets in time sequence. Pretty cool. So what this is this is actually quote stuffing on the stock exchanges. And it was done deliberately by a company to try to delay trading so that they could trade ahead of the market. The Nanex guys documented this. This is an example. You've heard of global warming, right? We're going to have global algorithming emerging from competition. People are going to compete, companies are going to compete with each other using algorithms. We see it in program trading today, right? Happens every day on the markets. You're going to see this in every industry. Your life is going to be dependent on how well your algorithms do. Actually kind of leads me to the third one. And you're going to have to worry about this because of this. Right? Everybody recognizes the Google self-driving car, pretty cool. I've got bad news for you. The internet doesn't eliminate liability. The thing that I don't think you're going to get truly autonomous self-driving cars for a very long time until the legal framework changes. And the reason is there has to be somebody to sue. And I'm not kidding. It's really true. I think there's going to be huge ethical, moral, challenging issues when accidents occur because algorithms interacted and caused death. That's a real thing. Final one, I'll leave you with this one. Here's the bright spot. I do think this new internet of 2031 is going to have some amazing opportunities that are going to be sort of an adjacent network. It's one of the things that I think is going to create huge innovation. And the people here at Lux, I think, have actually identified that. They've actually got people looking at this in a very serious way. And that is the energy market. I love this parallel of the Tesla Roadster sitting below the solar panels. It's an example of system thinking that we heard about earlier. And it's the idea that we can build a system. And what if we were to take this one step further and said we're going to use the internet to do peer-to-peer energy distribution? We already have this in solar panels to your neighbors, but what if your electric car can do an Airbnb, call it an energy B&B, for doing charging? All of a sudden our issues of, oh, there aren't enough charging stations go away when you can pull up to any house with a solar panel and charge your car. So that's Internet 2031. I'm sure Paul's going to have some comments, so I'm going to give it over to him, I think.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's a delight to be here. And you know, I had the same experience Mark did at Forrester, and learned from people like Carl who had been doing this for a long time. And for those of you who have never been an analyst, when you show up at a place like Forrester or like Lux, you are competing on ideas. And inevitably, there is someone who has just done something like declared the death of the web and defined what will come after it and has gotten huge press. And then they look at you and they say, so what do you have? And you have nothing like that. And you come to this crushing realization that it will take you an entire career to come up with something like that if you're lucky. And so this was the lesson that I absorbed. Is to listen to folks like Carl who know more about what they're talking about than I do, and then to perhaps, maybe, expand on one point. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to expand on one point, on one thing that Carl talked about, and that is that big data will simply be data. Big data is just a name for a phenomenon happening in the market. It's not a kind of technology. It is not a kind of solution, not even one made by Oracle. It is a market phenomenon. But why? Why does this idea hang around? If that's the case, why do we still hear so much about big data? You have heard an enormous amount of big data over the past 48 hours. So why does this marketing blather hang around?
We're changing the name of the service, by the way, for sure.
Oh, is that right?
Data and analytics, data analytics.
Well, and so you should call it data capital. So here is the reason that this term keeps hanging around, why we keep getting together to talk about it, is because there is a larger economic story behind all the talk about big data. And that larger economic story is the rise of data capital. Now, this is not a metaphor. We're not saying that data is the new oil, data is the new gold, data is the new electricity. I particularly like that one. That one's very good. Those are all metaphors. What we're saying here is that data fulfills the literal economic textbook definition of capital. So the way that we define this is that data capital is the recorded information necessary to produce a good or service. What we're saying is that data is an economic factor of production. And if you do not have the data for some new analytically driven service or algorithmically driven service, you can't produce it. The same way that a retailer who wants to go into a new market but lacks the financial capital to build the facilities, extend the supply chain, build out the inventory, cannot go. If they lack the financial capital, they cannot produce those facilities, they cannot enter that market. By the same token, if that retailer wants to create some new pricing algorithm, some new recommendation engine, but lacks the data to feed it, they can't do it. They cannot create that service. They lack the necessary inputs, just as if they lacked the financial capital, the capital equipment, or the labor to produce it. Now, this actually came up earlier today in one of the breakout sessions about the future of manufacturing. And the way it came up was there was a question about, well, okay, if we're going to have all this data coming off of new CNC machines, who gets it? Who gets to keep it? And there were folks who worked at manufacturing firms who were saying, I want it. I bought the machine. The machine produces data. It's about my manufacturing line. I want it. My data. One of the folks on the panel said, effectively, I hear you, but here's why that's probably the wrong answer. And what they were saying was, as an OEM, as an original equipment manufacturer of CNC machines, the OEM, using the data from all of the installed base of all of those CNC machines, will have a better ability to handle predictive maintenance, to reduce mean time to failure, in fact, reduce mean time to recovery by looking at the data about what services were applied and how well they worked in each kind of fix. The OEM will have a better ability to deliver those algorithmically driven services than any one of its customers doing that for itself. That debate was about who gets this scarce resource. It's absolutely true that we are producing more data than we know what to do with currently. However, it's not true that data is super abundant. In fact, data is extraordinarily scarce. And the reason is that all of these individual observations are either scarce or, in fact, unique. And if you don't have them, if you as the owner of the CNC machine on your manufacturing line, if you don't have the data from all of the other CNC machines of all of your rivals, you're at a competitive disadvantage, and the OEM is in a far better position not only to offer you a better service, but to then compete with their rivals to capture more market share in order to capture more data coming off of these machines, each observation of which is completely unique in order to create algorithmic services that their rivals cannot deliver. This is why seeing data as a kind of capital, not just a record of what happened, but a raw material for creating new algorithmic services and goods, is critical. So there are a couple of implications of the rise of data capital. There are a few implications on competitive strategy, a few implications on the future of enterprise computing. But we're going to talk about those just very briefly. But before I do that, let me just give you a little bit of confidence that there are others who are also making this same observation. So we all have heard the stories, you all have heard the stories about Uber and Airbnb and Alibaba, these companies which are literally substituting data capital for financial capital. They're substituting data capital for labor in some cases. And we know this because, as you've heard, Uber is the most valuable taxi company in the world, but they own no taxis. Airbnb is now valued in north of $10 billion, and they own no facilities that their customers stay in. Alibaba, largest online marketplace by merchandise value in the world, with merchandise valued at about $270 billion US, doesn't own any of that inventory. But you're also seeing things like McKinsey has said that the global trade, the global trade in data exceeds now the global trade in goods. So let me just repeat that. McKinsey they look at the global flows between nations, and in 2014 that was worth about $7.8 trillion. They say that the trade in data is worth 2.8 of that, and that 2.8 trillion is greater than the total international flow of goods traded. Data is a kind of capital. So what does this mean for, and just one last one, Ocean Tomo, a consultancy, has said that 84% of the market value of S&P 500 firms comes from intangible assets, including data. This is a crazy number. In dollars, this is roughly $15 trillion. Let's just say that's too big by half. Let's say it's twice as big. And the Federal Reserve Board has done their own research, and they estimate that perhaps 45% of the market value of S&P 500 firms is in intangibles. But that's still about $9 trillion. So data is a kind of capital. Far from being an abundant resource, it's actually made up of a huge number of individual, scarce, and unique observations. And this has implications for competitive strategy. The main issue, the main implication it has is the need for companies to create unique data capital. And this is not an idea that's exclusive to Oracle. This really comes from the work of Professor Porter at Harvard Business School, who describes strategy as creating unique value in a unique way. It's not enough to offer products and services that your customers can only get from you. You have to deliver them and produce them in a way that your rivals cannot easily copy. That's how you maintain a sustainable competitive advantage. Now, the way that data comes into play here is when you look at the origin of competitive advantage in a firm, it really has to do with the way that that company's activities are interconnected. The way that, for example, some companies will decide to build out an enormous sales force, but spend very little on marketing because they're a B2B company selling complicated products to sophisticated buyers. Well, that whole set of activities, how many people they hire in their sales force, what they invest in marketing, where, all those activities have to fit together in a unique way in order to reinforce the firm's unique value. Okay. The place where data comes into play here is that in every activity in the firm, information is both used and produced. And data is nothing more than digital information. And so data becomes an input and an output to and from all the activities in the firm and has potentially an enormous effect on competitive strategy. And here's how we think about it. There are three principles of data capital. Data comes from activity, data tends to make more data, and platforms tend to win. Now, I'll give you just a couple of examples here before we sit down and have a richer conversation. But let's start with the first one. Data comes from activity. Data is not a natural resource, and it costs something to capture it. You have to put sensors and mobile apps and applications into the world in order to capture it. Goes through built-out infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure to get to the data center, which also have to be built. So data is not a naturally occurring resource. You have to invest to capture it. And what we're seeing, of course, is more companies putting sensors and mobile apps in the world. One example of where this is happening in new ways is in auto insurance. So one of the largest auto insurers in Europe created boxes, little black boxes that you can plug into this data port in recent model sedans and capture data about the driving habits of those people. So how hard they brake, how hard they turn, how fast, of course, they're going, how often do they have jackrabbit starts where they step on the gas and jump off the line. Well, previously, the information created by that driving activity was being lost. Now, they create a device, the insurer creates a device, plugs it into the car, captures that data about that individual person's driving on that day, they are now capturing the data that comes from that driving activity. And for each one of those trips, that insurer has that data and no insurer can have it, because they'd have to go back in time to recreate that trip and make sure that their data capture device gets in there first. So data comes from activity, so you need to digitize and datafy activities before your rivals do, so that you can capture data and prevent it from falling into the hands of your competitors. The next issue is, well, what do you do with it? And so the second principle of data capital is that data tends to make more data. And here's one of the wicked ironies of the rise of data capital, is that you can use algorithms to create data about their own performance that you feed back into the algorithm in order to improve its future performance. Now, this is a standard feature of machine learning. It's actually a standard feature of complicated multi-body calculations going back to the 1300s, if I remember correctly. The reason this matters so much now is scale and speed. So if you've got an algorithm that is, say, doing dynamic pricing, like Uber's surge pricing, every time they run surge pricing and raise the price of their rides in order to provide an incentive for more supply to come online in order to meet the higher demand, they capture more data about how to walk the fine line between raising the price high enough to increase the supply without raising it so high that we all leave the service in disgust. That algorithm creates data about its own performance to improve its future performance. And this is a competitive advantage that's very hard to catch. The last principle here, platforms tend to win. Platforms are de rigueur in information-intensive industries. They are a standard feature of information-intensive industries. You all saw the battle for the desktop operating system between Microsoft and Apple. There's now the battle for the mobile operating system between Android and Apple, between Google and Apple. But you also see it in credit cards. American Express, Visa, MasterCard, they are all competing to be the platform for credit card processing. Here's why this matters. The digitization and datafication of more industries, of more daily activities, brings platform competition to industries that have never seen it before. So let me give you just one example. In farming, it is now possible to have a drone that will take spectrographic images of crops, do an analysis of those photos in order to figure out how much green is in the leaves, because that's a proxy for chlorophyll. That information is then fed to a fertilizer spreader on the back of the tractor, which changes the amount of fertilizer and the mix being spread on different areas of the field in order to maximize the yield of that field. The tractor in the middle is in competition to be the platform for digital agricultural services. This is not the way that tractor manufacturers normally think about waging competition. What is even crazier than that is that that tractor maker is in competition with the drone makers, as well as the makers of the fertilizer, as well as companies like Spire that run a new network of satellites capturing better, more finely grained weather imagery all over the world. So I'm gonna stop here. We'll leave the implications for enterprise computing for another time. The one thing that I would like you to remember from this is that data is a new kind of capital. It is not merely a record of what happened. It is a raw material for creating new digital products and services, and it leads to these competitive tactics. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I thought I had questions before, now I have new ones. But I also, again, want to make sure we have time for everybody else who wants to ask some. So first and foremost, I was really struck by the symmetry of data capital as, again, thinking about it as something tangible got my head going really well. At the same time, thinking about de-waste as the end result of that capital when it's been used, like that metaphor and that connection, there seems to be, like I said, I'm just starting to think about it, but how we make the argument to our CEOs, like big data is important and this is what we're going to do about it, it's still really intangible. Making it tangible in that metaphor seemed really helpful.
And actually, Paul was had a really great insight at lunchtime where he sort of said, well, the difference between trash and recycling is profit. If you do recycling, you make money doing that, presumably. You're doing recycling for a reason in most cases. If it's trash, you're probably not making any profit from trash. And I think that's the great dichotomy here as to thinking about data as capital versus data as de-waste. Is, are you making use of it? If you're just sitting on it, it's probably de-waste. If you're actually going to use it for something and going to make money from it, then it's capital. And the hard part is deciding how you do that.
Well, and this is the tricky bit, is that a given piece of data will go back and forth over that line depending on the context. So just to try to make it to make it more visible. The difference in what a recycling plant recycles is exactly what you said, is whether they can make a profit on it or not. And so, for example, when the price of oil falls, petroleum-based plastics become cheaper, and it no longer makes economic sense to recycle plastic bottles. So recycling facilities stop, and they start throwing out all of those bottles that you so earnestly put into the recycling bin. And the difference is profit. Now, so the thing with data, all right, so how does this apply to data? Part of the challenge is that it's so easy, you want to say you can't collect everything because there is a cost to capturing it, and there's a cost to storing it, and there's a cost to processing it, and a cost to analyzing it, and all this is true. At the same time, there is this option value on data. It is very difficult to know all of the good uses you might put a piece of data to, even beyond the problem that you tried to solve when you originally collected the thing.
Yeah. When we do engagements with clients, by the way we deal with this is a very real thing. People will say, oh, I have all this cool data. Tell me what to do with it. We actually turn it around. We sort of say, tell me your biggest business pain point, and then we'll tell you what data we should collect to sort that out. It's much simpler, narrows the space a lot faster. The number of combinations of multi-terabyte databases you can make is pretty big.
So I think this, the advantage of data, like how do you monetize that, again, came up in both of your talks, and I'd say that's been very pervasive throughout all the conversations I've had here. And the example you mentioned, like with the tractor competing with the drone, and how that turns into a platform. So if you have drone imagery, maybe not only of your own farm, but of an entire state or of an entire country, then you know kind of what the harvest is going to be like. You can start doing, trading on the commodity markets and things like that, and really kind of screw things up fast, even for the growers. So their ability to make profit, if they don't have that platform view, essentially goes away. Mm-hmm. So are there other industries that you guys have seen? Anybody in the audience feel like, ooh, that sounds like something that could happen in my industry? Is there some, like the places where it could happen right away, the places it's least likely to happen?
I'm not sure what the question
Well,
is.
like I'm thinking, so we talk a lot about, we've talked about automotive and food were two examples that I mentioned yesterday that I thought this exact thing could play out again here really quickly. Mm-hmm. Chemical manufacturing, so petrochemicals, we have been noodling on that for 2 years to see how could that happen in chemical manufacturing, and I haven't really come up with it. So are there other industries that you see somewhere in that span? Do you agree with that in the audience?
Well, I'll give you an example that reminds me of what you're talking about with a nation having spectrographic imagery of all of its food production land. Okay. And that can cause all kinds of problems. There is a push right now to help financial regulators get a systemic view of risk, of counterparty risk, because that was something that that the entire industry was blind to, and was a huge contributor to the last global financial collapse. It was conventional wisdom that the market had priced risk from collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps rationally. Turns out, no, it had really concentrated in a couple of small places, not small, but a couple of places, and that set off all of these triggers. All right, so now you have this issue that it would be good we think, for a regulator to have this systemic view now of all of these different complex financial vehicles and the counterparty risk of in case they fail under different circumstances. But then wait a minute, how do you then preserve the competitive advantage of each of those different theories of investment from each of those individual investment banks and things like that? And so this is a really thorny problem. There's a new regulatory body, FINRA, that is trying to work on this. There's some great work coming out of places like MIT. Professor Andrew Lowe, who is the head of the Laboratory for Financial Engineering. It's okay, that's funny. It's a truth, it's a real thing, is real thing. If you do financial engineering in a firm, you go to jail. But if you do it at MIT, you get your own lab. So they have worked on a way for a method where individual banks could contribute data about their value at risk, such that, and you run it through basically a close cousin of an encryption process, such that the output on the other side, you can never use that to reverse engineer the inputs. And that could give a regulator a systemic view while preserving the trade secrecy of the participating investment banks.
Yeah, here I think I'm going to do an analogy, which is when I heard Paul talking about, oh, we're going to have centralized planning, we're going to have one central regulatory authority, and I could see all the venture capitalists in the room sort of cringing, getting very worried that we're going to have central government. The way we deal with this is we create peer-to-peer networks. It's why the internet won over countless attempts to make a single, brilliantly designed network to share information. It's because you could simply federate everything together. I think one technology I haven't heard talked about a lot here today, but one that I think is key for the internet of 2030, because it's already kind of key now, is blockchain. If you haven't heard the term blockchain before, Bitcoin is probably a term you have heard. But that's a secure cryptographic way that companies can work together to create a common view of the world, but they don't have to reveal all of their information. As a matter of fact, it protects anonymity. I think you're going to see mechanisms like that to create markets in data for cases where you want to have a single unified view. That's the single, what do you call it, the roster, the schedule that people keep track of, the audit trail. You're going to have a single unified view, but no one company has the entire view. It's a really interesting idea.
Great, well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I assume there are some questions. So we have Mike's walking around. Vineet, I think, had his hand up first.
So Vineet Varma with ExxonMobil, very, very interesting talk. Question on data and latent value of data. You don't know what you need it for, but you're sure it'll be useful for something. How do you reconcile that? So as a consumer, I'm certainly a billionaire because my data is, I'm going to monetize it.
That's right.
And I'm going to charge you. In the European Union, they're particular about personally identifiable information. And when you collect it, you have to tell the user what you're collecting it for. By golly, in big data, I can't tell you what I'm collecting it for. So how do you reconcile the latent value and this big data phenomenon versus the regulation which are coming out?
I think we can't value the latent data currently. I think you'd need a data exchange for that to happen. At the moment, business models tend to do that. So I would argue Google is delivering you content because they're selling your personal data. That's the way they're monetizing it. Not so legal in some jurisdictions, but that's kind of the way I view that. They have taken latent data and monetized it, and therefore it now has value, and now regulators can look at that. But I think until there's a market, you can't really value it, and that's why markets get created.
There's a great book, actually, about big data, appropriately enough called Big Data. It's a revolution in how we think, work, and live, something like that. Ken Cukier is one of the co-authors. He's the data editor from The Economist, Cukier. They hit on this point, and the way that they talk about it is that getting value out of big data through reuse makes a complete nonsense of informed consent. And it's kind of that's a bit of a hard line. That's just difficult to get around. If you intend to use data for, if you want to preserve the option to create new value from data that you're collecting today, by definition, you can't tell people what you're going to do with it. So now you have to figure out how do you structure your permissions in order to manage this risk, but you also can look at your own data processes as a way to manage your risk and manage the risk of the people from whom you are collecting data, the risk of re-identification of data, for example. In any case, you got different regulatory approaches in the US. The US is really focusing on regulating use. The EU is really focusing on regulating capture, which is more restrictive. But let's say you can't change those things. And let's say instead you're just going to try to make the most of what you have. One of the ways to think about it is to really beef up your abilities around anonymization of data. So that includes the automated elimination of personally identifiable information like taxpayer IDs and things like that. But it could also be combined with making aggregates. So you decide that you're going to make certain roll-ups of certain sets of data based on a particular field, a particular attribute. If you do that, don't limit yourself to just one kind of aggregation, because you're going to want to take different perspectives on the data. But then you also need to look at, okay, who has access to that system. Perhaps you want to do some masking of the data, so you can actually have the real data there, but you are concealing personally identifiable information. In any case, I think that there are ways to appropriately innovate with that data that preserves the anonymity of those who contributed it, yet gives you a way to try to create new services and products from it.
Future Internet principle number 3, the Internet does not absolve you of liability.
In the back?
Yep. Okay, there I am. Hi, Kevin C. from Lux Research. Thank you, guys. That was really interesting. I wanted to pose a counterpoint to this idea of, I think, your first vision for de-waste. And some of the work we've done, and particularly my colleague, Isaac, has looked at edge analytics. And the whole value proposition of this is to filter out and ensure that the data that you do send is actually useful.
Has
ultimately.
value, yep.
And the other aspect of this is also that it's not free for them to do this either. So isn't there, on the one hand, there's a push to do this smarter computing at the edge, and on the other, it costs you money to blindly dump data. So in light of that, do you still see this as being a problem?
I do. I mean, people won't collect data willy-nilly because it costs money to transmit it as well. Particularly if you're doing it wirelessly, it's actually pretty expensive to transmit data. So I think there is some pushback. There's some market forces at work there. But nonetheless, there's a lot of data collected that is really worthless, and it's mainly because companies just never thought that it would be a good idea to scrub it before it got sent. By the way, compression works really well, but it also reduces time, right? So if I say, oh, all right, I'm going to store an hour, and then I'm going to compress it before I send it. Okay, I've got all the data, but I'm sending it in really small chunks because I compressed it. That's cool. Very good practice. But it does cost money, as you say. So lots of ways you can address the issue, but I think we still end up with a lot of de-waste.
I was just wondering about the point about legal liability. In the off chance that you're looking at basically a common register for data, wouldn't that become, in so many words, the arbitration arena for data and justice, in so many words?
Wow. Yes. And that's probably why you don't want to have a single centralized record. We were actually, again, talking about this at lunch. I wish you could have come to lunch. We had a great discussion. But I think we are going to be challenged to have a common record for the purposes, not just regulation, but for the purposes of valuing things, for the purposes of privacy, for ethics, as I alluded to, when we have algorithms running cars in full autonomous mode and they run into each other, who's at fault? It's not easy to know, and maybe we need a third party that collects the system of record. It's one of the reasons I like the Namex guys, by the way. It was literally 3 guys in Chicago who put together the system for recording all the trades on all 12 major exchanges, getting synchronized timestamps on them so they could see things like the flash crash of 2010 and assign blame. They have done this. They have actually been awarded a medal by the SEC because they did this. Nobody else does that. None of the regulatory authorities had that trail. The Nanex guys did. So there's opportunities in that business model.
So I think it's also, this is a good place to look at history for lessons, as Doug was talking about earlier. In the beginning of the 20th century, when electricity was a big deal, brand new thing, and you could have illumination in your factories that wouldn't blow them up. It was brilliant. One of the downsides was that you could then, as a factory owner, run shifts 24/7. Completely changing the rhythm of life for the majority of workers. I mean, the rhythm of life that had always been. And so you saw new regulations. You saw, in fact, the creation of new governmental bodies like OSHA. And I think that there's, I think we're in one of those times. The digitization and datafication of more activities in private, public, and commercial life is an epical change, like the electrification of the modern economy. And so I think you can look at places. You can look to folks like Larry Lessig at Harvard, who's really grappling in a heroic way with these new legal needs. And we see it in our own way too. I mean, we see, for example, a dramatic increase in the need for audit trails that you have that are like standard in the database across the entire Hadoop and NoSQL infrastructure. And that's not just who got access to the data, but it's what Spark routine went and grabbed some data set, loaded it, and parsed it, and what did it do? So, there has to be a comprehensive audit trail for that whole thing as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, and please join me in thanking Carl and Paul. And we will have time, if anybody's staying around, to do talk more after this. But I think we have a few more words from Dennis, and then we're wrapping up. So again, Carl and Paul, thank you.